The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like secrets waiting to be revealed. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell stood at the imposing gates, her breath visible in the cold December air as she reviewed the file that would change everything she thought she knew about the British royal family. The document in her hands was unlike any police report she had ever encountered. It detailed allegations so serious that they threatened to shake the very foundations of the monarchy itself. James Whitmore had been a royal protection officer for 12 years. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his dedication to the crown absolute. Until 3 months ago, when everything changed. Now he sat across from Sarah in a secure interview room, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted events that seemed impossible to believe. "You have to understand," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never wanted this to happen. I served the royal family with pride. I would have died for them without hesitation. But, what I witnessed, what Queen Camilla did. I cannot stay silent anymore." Sarah leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. The room was sterile and cold, but the tension was thick enough to cut. Outside, the world continued as normal, unaware that one of the biggest scandals in royal history was about to unfold. James Whitmore was 42 years old, married with 2 young children. He had joined the Metropolitan Police straight from university, driven by a desire to serve his country. His progression through the ranks had been steady and impressive. When the opportunity to join the Royal Protection Squad arose 8 years into his career, it felt like the pinnacle of his professional life. The screening process had been intense, involving background checks that went back 3 generations, psychological evaluations, and physical fitness tests that pushed him to his limits. The first few years had been everything he had dreamed of and more. He had traveled the world, protected some of the most important people on the planet, and been trusted with state secrets that most people could never imagine. His colleagues respected him, his superiors valued his judgment, and his family was proud of his achievements. Queen Camilla had always been a complex figure to protect. Unlike other members of the royal family who had grown up with constant security, she had lived most of her life as a private citizen. The adjustment to royal life had not been easy for her, and this sometimes created tension with the protection team. She could be demanding, unpredictable, and occasionally dismissive of security protocols that she found inconvenient. But James had always been professional. He understood that the stress of royal life could make people behave in ways that were out of character. He had seen it with other members of the family over the years. The constant scrutiny, the lack of privacy, the weight of public expectation, it could break even the strongest person. The first incident that troubled James had occurred during a private visit to a charity in East London. Queen Camilla had been visiting a shelter for homeless women, a cause close to her heart. The public appearance had gone well, with positive coverage in the media and genuine warmth from the women at the shelter. But what happened afterward, away from the cameras, had left James deeply uncomfortable. After the official visit ended, Queen Camilla had requested a private meeting with the shelter's director, Margaret Collins. Margaret was a woman in her 60s who had dedicated her life to helping vulnerable women. She had built the shelter from nothing, working tirelessly to secure funding and support for women who had nowhere else to turn. James had been stationed outside the meeting room, as was protocol for private royal conversations. But the walls were thin, and voices had a way of carrying. What he heard through that door would haunt him for months to come. The conversation had started normally enough, with Queen Camilla expressing genuine interest in the shelter's work. But, then, the tone had changed dramatically. Margaret had apparently raised concerns about recent government cuts to funding for homeless services. She had spoken passionately about the women who would suffer as a result, about families being torn apart and vulnerable people being left with nowhere to turn. Queen Camilla's response had been shocking in its cruelty. She had dismissed Margaret's concerns as emotional nonsense and suggested that homeless people were largely responsible for their own situations. The words that followed were even worse. She had made disparaging comments about the women in the shelter, using language that was both classist and deeply hurtful. But it was what happened next that crossed the line completely. Margaret had apparently become upset, perhaps even emotional, at hearing such callous words about the women she worked so hard to help. Queen Camilla's reaction had been swift and vicious. James heard the sound of something being thrown, followed by Margaret's cry of pain and shock. When James entered the room moments later, responding to the sound of distress, he found Margaret on the floor, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Queen Camilla stood over her, a heavy crystal paperweight in her hand. The look on the Queen's face was one of cold satisfaction, as if she had enjoyed inflicting pain on someone she saw as beneath her. She became hysterical, Queen Camilla had said calmly, as if explaining away a minor inconvenience. I was forced to defend myself. But James had seen enough domestic violence cases in his years as a police officer to know what he was looking at. This was not self-defense. This was assault, pure and simple. And the victim was a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. Margaret had been too shocked and frightened to say anything at the time. The presence of royalty, the shock of what had happened, and the implicit threat of what might occur if she spoke out had left her speechless. James had helped her to her feet and ensured she received medical attention, but he had been sworn to secrecy about what had really happened. The official story, crafted by the palace's communications team, was that Margaret had suffered a minor accident during the meeting. The cut on her head was explained away as a result of her fainting and hitting her head on a table. The shelter received a generous anonymous donation shortly afterward, ensuring their continued operation despite the government cuts. For weeks, James had tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he had witnessed. Perhaps Queen Camilla had been defending herself. Perhaps Margaret had been more aggressive than he had realized. But, deep down, he knew the truth. He had watched a member of the royal family assault an innocent woman and, then, cover it up with lies and money. The second incident had occurred just 6 weeks later, during a state dinner at Buckingham Palace. The event was attended by foreign dignitaries, government ministers, and other high-ranking officials. James had been assigned to coordinate security for the evening, a role that required him to be present throughout the event. Among the guests was Dr. Amira Hassan, a Syrian refugee who had become a prominent advocate for human rights. She had been invited to speak about her work with displaced families and the importance of international cooperation in addressing the refugee crisis. Her story was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a former surgeon who had fled her homeland with nothing but her children and her determination to rebuild their lives. Dr. Hassan's speech had been moving and well received by most of the guests. She had spoken eloquently about the need for compassion and understanding, about the shared humanity that connected all people regardless of their nationality or circumstances. Her words had brought tears to the eyes of many in attendance. But Queen Camilla's reaction had been very different. James had watched as her expression grew increasingly hostile throughout the speech. Her body language became tense and aggressive, and she had whispered what appeared to be derogatory comments to the guests seated near her. After the formal dinner ended, there was a reception where guests could mingle and continue their conversations. James had been monitoring the room when he noticed Queen Camilla approaching Dr. Hassan near the palace's famous painting collection. What happened next would prove to be even more shocking than the incident at the homeless shelter. James had positioned himself within earshot, as was standard protocol when royalty was engaged in conversation with foreign guests. The conversation had begun cordially enough, but it quickly took a dark turn. Queen Camilla had begun making increasingly hostile comments about immigration and refugees, using language that was both inflammatory and deeply offensive. Dr. Hassan had remained dignified throughout the verbal assault, attempting to engage in reasoned discussion about the complexities of the refugee crisis. But Queen Camilla had become increasingly aggressive, eventually making personal attacks on Dr. Hassan's background and character. The situation had escalated when Queen Camilla had grabbed Dr. Hassan's arm forcefully, her fingernails digging into the woman's skin hard enough to draw blood. The physical contact had been accompanied by threats about what would happen if Dr. Hassan ever spoke publicly about their conversation. James had intervened at that point, citing security protocols that required him to escort Dr. Hassan to another part of the palace. The Syrian woman had been visibly shaken by the encounter, but, like Margaret Collins before her, she had been too intimidated and shocked to report what had happened. The pattern was becoming clear to James. Queen Camilla appeared to take particular pleasure in targeting vulnerable women, especially those who were in positions where they could not easily defend themselves or seek justice. The power dynamic was always heavily skewed in her favor, and she seemed to understand exactly how to exploit that advantage. These incidents had weighed heavily on James's conscience. He had joined the police force to protect people, to serve justice, and to uphold the law. Yet here he was, complicit in covering up serious crimes simply because of who had committed them. The conflict between his oath as a police officer and his duty to the crown was tearing him apart. The breaking point had come 3 months ago, during what should have been a routine visit to a children's hospital in Manchester. Queen Camilla had been scheduled to open a new wing dedicated to treating young cancer patients. It was the kind of engagement that typically generated positive publicity for the royal family and brought genuine joy to the children and families involved. James had been looking forward to this particular assignment. After months of witnessing Queen Camilla's cruelty, he hoped that seeing her interact with sick children might remind him of why he had chosen to protect the royal family in the first place. Perhaps there was still some good in her, some trace of the compassion that the public believed she possessed. The visit had started well. Queen Camilla had been photographed with several young patients, and the media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive. She had seemed genuinely moved by the children's stories and had spoken eloquently about the importance of supporting medical research and care for young people. But, once again, it was what happened away from the cameras that revealed the truth about Queen Camilla's character. During a private meeting with the hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Patricia Williams, James had witnessed something that would finally push him to take action. Dr. Williams had been discussing the hospital's financial challenges, explaining how budget cuts and reduced government funding were making it increasingly difficult to provide the level of care that these children deserved. She had spoken passionately about specific cases: children who had been forced to wait longer for treatment, families who had been driven to bankruptcy by medical bills, research projects that had been cancelled due to lack of funding. Queen Camilla's response had been swift and brutal. She had accused Dr. Williams of being manipulative and emotionally exploitative. But, worse than her words was what she did next. In a fit of rage that seemed to come from nowhere, she had swept her arm across Dr. Williams's desk, sending papers, photos of young patients, and personal items crashing to the floor. Among the items that had fallen was a framed photograph of Dr. Williams's own daughter, who had died of leukemia several years earlier at the age of 8. The glass had shattered when it hit the floor, destroying the image and cutting Dr. Williams's hand when she had instinctively reached to save it. James had watched in horror as Queen Camilla had stood over the broken photograph and spoken words that would echo in his mind for weeks to come. Perhaps if you spent less time wallowing in the past and more time doing your job properly, fewer children would die on your watch. Dr. Williams had collapsed into her chair, sobbing as she cradled the broken frame containing the last good photograph she had of her daughter. The cruelty of the moment, the calculated nature of the attack on something so personal and precious, had been too much for James to bear. That night, James had gone home to his own family with a heavy heart. His 8-year-old daughter had run to greet him at the door, full of excitement about her day at school. As he held her close, he thought about Dr. Williams and the daughter she had lost. He thought about all the vulnerable women who had suffered at Queen Camilla's hands, and all the ones who might suffer in the future if he continued to stay silent. It was then that James Whitmore made the decision that would change his life forever. He could no longer be complicit in protecting someone who used her position to hurt innocent people. His oath as a police officer, his duty as a human being, and his love for his own family all demanded that he take action. The decision to file a lawsuit against Queen Camilla had not been easy. James knew that he was risking everything: his career, his reputation, his family's security, and, potentially, even their safety. The power of the royal family was immense, and their ability to destroy those who opposed them was well documented throughout history. But, as James sat across from Detective Inspector Mitchell in that cold interview room, recounting the events that had led him to this moment, he felt something he had not experienced in months: relief. Finally, the truth was being told. Finally, someone was listening. And, finally, there might be justice for the women who had suffered in silence. Sarah Mitchell had heard many shocking stories in her years as a detective, but nothing had prepared her for what James Whitmore was telling her. The implications of his allegations were staggering. If true, they suggested that one of the most senior members of the British royal family was a serial abuser who had used her position to escape accountability for serious crimes. But Sarah was also acutely aware of the challenges they faced. Proving allegations against royalty was never simple. The palace had vast resources, skilled lawyers, and the ability to discredit accusers in ways that ordinary citizens could never imagine. The case would require meticulous preparation, ironclad evidence, and witnesses brave enough to testify against one of the most powerful women in Britain. As the interview continued into the afternoon, Sarah found herself believing every word that James told her. His account was detailed, consistent, and delivered with the kind of emotional authenticity that was difficult to fake. But belief was not enough. In the courts of law and public opinion, they would need much more than one man's testimony, no matter how credible he appeared to be. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, but the road ahead would be long, dangerous, and uncertain. Queen Camilla's alleged reign of cruelty was about to face its greatest challenge, and the monarchy itself was about to be tested in ways that no one could have imagined. The law offices of Harrison, Bentley and Associates occupied 3 floors of a prestigious building in the heart of London's legal district. Rebecca Harrison had built her reputation over 25 years by taking on cases that other lawyers considered impossible. She specialized in representing ordinary people against powerful institutions, and her success rate was legendary. When James Whitmore first walked into her office, she knew immediately that this would be the case that would define her career. Rebecca was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She had grown up in a working-class family in Birmingham and had fought for every opportunity she had ever received. Her path to becoming one of London's most respected barristers had been marked by countless battles against those who believed that justice was only for the wealthy and well-connected. James sat across from her mahogany desk, still wearing his civilian clothes but somehow maintaining the rigid posture that 12 years of police work had ingrained in him. His wife Sarah sat beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his, providing the moral support that had kept him going through the darkest moments of his decision to speak out. "Mr. Whitmore," Rebecca began, her voice steady and professional, "I want you to understand exactly what we're facing here. Queen Camilla is not just any defendant. She is protected by centuries of legal precedent, royal immunity, and the full resources of the crown. The palace will throw everything they have at discrediting you, your testimony, and your character. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" James looked at his wife, drawing strength from her encouraging nod, before turning back to Rebecca. "I've seen what she's capable of, Ms. Harrison. I've watched her hurt innocent people and use her position to cover it up. If I don't speak out, who will? How many more women will suffer because I was too scared to do what's right?" Rebecca had handled many high-profile cases, but none quite like this. The legal challenges were unprecedented. Royal immunity had protected members of the British royal family from prosecution for centuries, but it had never been tested in a case involving such serious allegations of personal misconduct. The law was murky, the precedents were unclear, and the stakes could not have been higher. The first challenge was gathering evidence. James's testimony alone, while compelling, would not be enough to build a case that could survive the legal onslaught that was sure to come. They needed corroborating witnesses, physical evidence, and documentation that could support his claims. Rebecca assigned her best investigative team to begin the delicate process of reaching out to potential witnesses. Margaret Collins, the homeless shelter director, was their first priority. When Rebecca's investigator, David Chen, finally tracked her down, they discovered that Margaret had left London shortly after the incident with Queen Camilla and was now living quietly in a small village in Wales. David found her working in her garden behind a modest cottage, tending to roses that bloomed despite the approaching winter. She was a small woman with kind eyes, but those eyes carried a sadness that spoke of trauma that had never fully healed. When David explained why he was there, Margaret's reaction was immediate and visceral. "I can't," she said, dropping her gardening tools and backing away from him. "You don't understand what they're capable of. I have grandchildren now. I have a peaceful life. I won't let them destroy that." David spent 3 hours with Margaret that afternoon, listening as she finally told someone the full story of what had happened that day at the shelter. Her account matched James's testimony in every detail, but also revealed additional horrors that even James had not witnessed. After Queen Camilla had assaulted her, Margaret explained, representatives from the palace had visited her multiple times. They had offered her money, threatened her funding, and made it clear that speaking out would result in consequences that would extend far beyond her own life. The anonymous donation that had saved her shelter had come with strings attached, a signed agreement that effectively silenced her forever. They made me choose, Margaret said, tears streaming down her weathered face. Stay quiet and keep helping the women who need me, or speak out and watch everything I've built be destroyed. How could I choose my own justice over the lives of all those vulnerable women? Dr. Amira Hassan proved even more difficult to find. After the incident at Buckingham Palace, she had returned to her work with refugee organizations, but had moved several times and seemed to be deliberately avoiding publicity. When David finally located her at a small office in North London, her reaction was one of terror. They told me that my refugee status could be reviewed, she whispered, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting to be watched. They reminded me that my children's future in this country depends on their goodwill. How can I risk everything my family has sacrificed for? We escaped war, poverty, and persecution to build a life here. I cannot throw it all away, even for justice. Dr. Hassan's hands shook as she recounted her experience with Queen Camilla. The physical assault had been bad enough, but the psychological trauma had been even worse. She made me feel like nothing, Amira said. Like my life, my children's lives, the lives of all the people I try to help, like none of it mattered to her. She looked at me like I was an insect that had dared to speak in her presence. David's meeting with Dr. Patricia Williams at the Children's Hospital yielded similar results. Dr. Williams had clearly been devastated by her encounter with Queen Camilla, but she was also terrified of the consequences of speaking out. The hospital had received a massive donation shortly after the incident, enough to fund their research for the next 5 years, but Dr. Williams had been forced to sign multiple confidentiality agreements in exchange. Do you know how many children that money will help? Dr. Williams asked, her voice breaking. How can I be selfish enough to risk their lives for my own sense of justice? Queen Camilla knew exactly what she was doing when she structured it that way. She made it impossible for me to speak out without feeling like I was betraying the very children I've sworn to protect. Each potential witness that David approached told a similar story. They had all been silenced through a combination of financial incentives, legal threats, and emotional manipulation that preyed on their deepest fears and responsibilities. Queen Camilla and her representatives had been systematic and thorough in ensuring that no one would ever feel safe enough to speak out against her. But David's investigation also uncovered something else, a pattern of behavior that went back much further than James had realized. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, he began to piece together evidence of other incidents spanning nearly a decade. There was the incident at a veterans' charity event where Queen Camilla had allegedly pushed an elderly war veteran who had questioned her about government cuts to military pensions. The man had fallen and broken his hip, but the official story was that he had suffered a dizzy spell due to his medication. There was the confrontation with a young journalist who had asked challenging questions about royal expenses during a press conference. Witnesses reported seeing Queen Camilla corner the woman afterward and make threats about her career prospects. The journalist had left the industry entirely within 6 months. There was the incident at a school opening where Queen Camilla had allegedly struck a teacher who had dared to criticize education funding cuts. The teacher had been transferred to a different school shortly afterward and had signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement as part of her severance package. Each case followed the same pattern, an act of violence or intimidation against someone who was vulnerable or who had challenged Queen Camilla's authority, followed by a cover-up involving money, threats, and legal agreements designed to ensure silence. Rebecca knew that even with this pattern of behavior, proving the allegations in court would be extraordinarily difficult. The witnesses were too frightened to testify, the physical evidence had been carefully hidden or destroyed, and the palace's legal team would undoubtedly claim that all the incidents were either accidents, misunderstandings, or outright fabrications. But Rebecca had one advantage that the palace might not have anticipated: James Whitmore himself. As a royal protection officer, he had been required to keep detailed logs of all his activities and observations. These logs, while officially property of the Metropolitan Police, contained a wealth of information that could corroborate his testimony. The process of obtaining access to these logs required delicate negotiations with James's former superiors at Scotland Yard. Many of his colleagues were sympathetic to his position, but they were also bound by strict confidentiality agreements and protocols that governed the handling of royal security information. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had become an unofficial ally in their efforts to build the case. While she could not openly support James's lawsuit, she had made it clear that she believed his allegations and was committed to ensuring that any criminal investigation was conducted thoroughly and fairly. The breakthrough came when Rebecca's team discovered that James was not the only royal protection officer to have witnessed Queen Camilla's behavior. Through careful networking and discreet inquiries, they identified 3 other current or former officers who had observed similar incidents. P.C. Martin Davies had been present during the incident at the Veterans Charity event. He had written a detailed report about what he had witnessed, but the report had been classified and buried within the Metropolitan Police's files. When David Chen approached him, Martin initially refused to discuss the matter, citing his oath of loyalty and his ongoing career. But Martin was also a veteran himself, having served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the police force. The idea that an elderly war hero had been deliberately assaulted by someone he had sworn to protect clearly troubled him deeply. After several conversations with David, he finally agreed to provide a sworn statement about what he had witnessed. Sergeant Lisa Thompson had been the officer assigned to security detail during the incident with the young journalist. Like Martin, she had filed a report that had been classified and hidden from public view. Lisa was a single mother who depended on her police salary to support her family, and she was initially terrified of the consequences of speaking out. But Lisa was also someone who had joined the police force because she believed in justice and protecting the innocent. The image of Queen Camilla threatening a young woman who was just doing her job haunted her. When Rebecca offered to provide legal protection for any police officers who agreed to testify, Lisa finally agreed to come forward. The 3rd officer, Inspector Robert Hayes, had been present during the incident at the school. He was nearing retirement and felt that he had less to lose by speaking out than his younger colleagues. Robert had kept meticulous personal notes about all his royal assignments, and those notes contained damning details about Queen Camilla's behavior toward the teacher who had questioned her. With 4 police officers now willing to testify about Queen Camilla's pattern of abusive behavior, Rebecca felt that they finally had the foundation for a case that could survive legal challenges. But she also knew that the palace would not give up without a fight, and that the real battle was just beginning. The palace's initial response to news of the lawsuit was swift and predictable. They issued a statement denying all allegations and describing James Whitmore as a disgruntled former employee with a history of mental health issues and financial difficulties. They questioned his credibility and suggested that his claims were motivated by a desire for attention and monetary compensation. The statement was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about James's character and motivations without directly addressing the specific allegations he had made. It was a classic public relations strategy designed to shift the focus from Queen Camilla's alleged actions to James's supposed shortcomings as a person and professional. But the palace had underestimated both James Whitmore's integrity and Rebecca Harrison's skill as a litigator. Rebecca had anticipated this line of attack and had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive response that addressed each element of the palace's character assassination attempt. James's service record as a police officer was exemplary, with numerous commendations and not a single disciplinary action in over 15 years of service. His mental health evaluation as part of his Royal Protection Officer training had shown no signs of instability or psychological issues that would affect his reliability as a witness. As for financial difficulties, Rebecca was able to demonstrate that James had actually taken a significant pay cut by leaving his position with the Royal Protection Squad. His decision to file the lawsuit had cost him his career, his pension prospects, and his family's financial security. It was hardly the action of someone motivated by monetary gain. The media response to the lawsuit was intense and divided. Some outlets focused on the sensational nature of the allegations, treating the story as a tabloid scandal rather than a serious legal matter. Others took a more measured approach, recognizing the gravity of the accusations and the potential implications for the monarchy. Public opinion was similarly split. Queen Camilla had always been a polarizing figure, with some viewing her as a woman who had been unfairly vilified for her past relationship with King Charles, while others saw her as an opportunist who had manipulated her way into the royal family. The allegations in James's lawsuit seemed to confirm the worst suspicions of her critics while shocking those who had hoped she might bring a more modern, compassionate approach to royal duties. Social media exploded with debates about the case. Hashtags supporting both James Whitmore and Queen Camilla began trending within hours of the news breaking. Supporters of James praised his courage in speaking out against powerful corruption, while defenders of Queen Camilla dismissed the allegations as politically motivated attacks on the monarchy. But, perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of other potential witnesses who had previously been too frightened to speak out. As news of the lawsuit spread, Rebecca's office began receiving calls from people who claimed to have witnessed similar incidents or to have been victims of Queen Camilla's alleged abuse themselves. A former palace staff member contacted them with stories of Queen Camilla's treatment of servants and lower-ranking employees. A charity worker described an incident where Queen Camilla had allegedly struck a volunteer who had made a minor mistake during a royal visit. A hospital patient claimed that Queen Camilla had verbally abused her when she had asked for an autograph during a supposedly private visit. Each new allegation followed the same pattern that James had described: Queen Camilla targeting vulnerable people who were unlikely to be believed if they spoke out, using her position of power to intimidate and silence them, and relying on the palace's resources to cover up any evidence of her misconduct. Rebecca knew that many of these new claims would be difficult to verify or might be motivated by a desire for attention rather than a genuine pursuit of justice. But, the sheer volume of similar stories suggested that James Whitmore's experience was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden from public view for years. As the legal team prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging case of their careers, Rebecca reflected on the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were not just trying to hold one person accountable for their actions, they were challenging a system that had protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable for centuries. The monarchy's survival had always depended on maintaining an image of moral authority and divine right to rule. If Queen Camilla could be held accountable for her alleged crimes in a court of law, it would establish a precedent that could fundamentally change the relationship between the royal family and the people they claimed to serve. But Rebecca also understood the personal cost that this battle would extract from everyone involved. James Whitmore had already sacrificed his career and his family's security to pursue justice. The other officers who had agreed to testify were risking their own livelihoods and safety. The victims who were finally speaking out were confronting their deepest fears and traumas. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome was far from certain. But, as Rebecca looked at the evidence they had gathered and the testimony they had collected, she felt something she had rarely experienced in her long career: absolute moral certainty that they were fighting for something larger than any individual case. They were fighting for the principle that no one, regardless of their position or power, should be above the law. They were fighting for justice for victims who had been silenced and ignored for far too long. And they were fighting for the idea that courage and truth could triumph over privilege and corruption, even when the odds seemed impossible. The royal courts of justice stood like a fortress of grey stone against the London sky, its Gothic towers and elaborate facade serving as a monument to centuries of British law and tradition. Inside these hallowed halls, some of the most important legal battles in the nation's history had been fought and decided. Today, it would witness something unprecedented: a member of the royal family facing serious criminal charges in open court. Sir Geoffrey Pemberton QC was widely regarded as the finest barrister in England. At 73 years old, he had argued cases before the House of Lords, represented prime ministers and foreign heads of state, and had never lost a case that involved the reputation of the British establishment. His appointment as Queen Camilla's lead counsel had surprised no one. When the monarchy was under threat, they called upon the very best defense money could buy. Pemberton was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that had intimidated countless witnesses over his 5-decade career. He moved through the courthouse with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own abilities or questioned his place in the natural order of things. To him, the case against Queen Camilla was not just a legal matter, it was an attack on the fundamental principles that held British society together. As he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most important case of his career, Pemberton was acutely aware that he was fighting for much more than his client's reputation. The monarchy itself hung in the balance, and, with it, the entire system of privilege and tradition that had shaped his own life and worldview. Rebecca Harrison arrived at the courthouse that morning with her team, knowing that they faced not just one of the finest legal minds in the country, but the full weight of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. The contrast between her modest legal practice and the resources arrayed against her was stark, but Rebecca had built her career on David versus Goliath battles, and she was prepared for the fight of her life. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had queued for hours to witness history in the making. Security was unprecedented, with armed police officers stationed throughout the building and metal detectors screening everyone who entered. The presence of so many reporters created an atmosphere of electric tension, as everyone present understood that the outcome of this trial could reshape British society forever. Justice Eleanor Hartwell had been assigned to preside over the case, an appointment that had generated considerable controversy in legal circles. At 58, she was one of the youngest judges ever to handle such a high-profile case, but she was also known for her absolute commitment to judicial independence and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful interests. Justice Hartwell came from a middle-class background in Manchester and had worked her way through law school while supporting herself with part-time jobs. Her appointment to the High Court bench had been based purely on merit, and she had earned a reputation for fairness and integrity that transcended political boundaries. If anyone could ensure that Queen Camilla received a fair trial while also protecting the rights of her accusers, it was Eleanor Hartwell. The opening statements began with Sir Geoffrey Pemberton rising to address the court with the kind of theatrical gravitas that had made him legendary. His voice filled the courtroom as he painted a picture of James Whitmore as an unstable former police officer seeking attention and financial gain through false accusations against one of the most respected members of the royal family. "My lord," Pemberton began, his voice resonating with authority, "we are here today because a man who was entrusted with protecting Her Majesty Queen Camilla has chosen to betray the trust in the most despicable way imaginable. Mr. James Whitmore, a former police officer with documented mental health issues and significant financial pressures, has concocted a series of increasingly outlandish allegations designed to damage the reputation of a woman who has dedicated her life to serving the British people." Pemberton's strategy was clear from the beginning: attack the credibility of the accusers while portraying Queen Camilla as the victim of a malicious campaign. He spoke eloquently about her charitable work, her dedication to various causes, and her dignified response to years of unfair media scrutiny.